From the wilderness of Kodiak Island, Alaska, this is Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier with your host, Robin Barefield. In a land full of peril and vicious animals, humans are the most dangerous predators of all.
When crew members decide to abandon a floundering ship in the North Pacific in the winter in 20-foot seas, they know they are unlikely to survive, even when they do everything right. If the captain can send out a mayday, everyone dons a pristine survival suit and seals it around their face, and they deploy and enter a life raft, they still face a long list of things that could and often do go wrong. Proper gear, training, and the captain's strong, calm, logical voice significantly increased the crew's chances of survival. The crew of the FV St. Patrick had none of these things, and they paid a horrible price for their decisions. In the mid-1970s through 1980s, the death rate for commercial fishermen soared to 75 times the U.S. national average for deaths on the job. And the mortality rate for fishing in Alaska in the winter peaked 25 times higher than the death toll for the rest of the commercial fishing industry. It was 9 times more dangerous for an individual to take a job fishing in the winter in Alaska than to become a miner or logger, the two following most hazardous jobs. Strict changes in government oversight of mandatory safety equipment and crew training brought these numbers down. Many commercial fishermen did not welcome new regulations in their industry, but the St. Patrick disaster demonstrated the necessity of these safety measures. Welcome to Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier. I'm your host, Robin Barefield, and I'm broadcasting to you from the heart of the Kodiak National Wildlife Refuge on Kodiak Island in Alaska. The 138-foot-long fishing vessel St. Patrick was built in Bath, Maine in 1948. Because it weighed over 200 net tons, the Coast Guard required a licensed captain, first officer, and engineer to operate the vessel. In 1981, Leroy Wharton of Hampton, Virginia, one of the owners of the St. Patrick, hired Al Palmer, an experienced fisherman and a licensed master, to run the boat to Kodiak, Alaska, and use it to fish commercially for scallops. For the next 6 months, Palmer and his crew caught and shucked scallops and delivered their catch to a processing plant in Kodiak. In November 1981, Palmer took a break from the boat, and Cornelius Green assumed command of the vessel. Green was not licensed as a master, so the boat operated illegally when it departed under his command on its final voyage in late November. The crew consisted of 11 men and 1 woman. The woman, Vanessa Sandin, 18, was from Kodiak, and she was the cook. Vanessa had previously worked on her father's fishing boat in Bristol Bay. Most of the men were young, had little experience on a fishing boat, and hailed from the lower 48. On Sunday, November 29th, the wind increased out of the northeast, and by evening it was gusting over 65 knots, or 71 miles per hour. Green told the crew to secure the deck while he pulled the throttle back and steered the St. Patrick slowly into the oncoming waves. Late that night, Green inexplicably turned the helm over to an underskilled crew member, and the young man struggled to keep the boat under control in the heavy seas and strong winds. Shortly after midnight, a 25-foot wave struck the St. Patrick on the port side, smashing several windows in the wheelhouse and demolishing the port side engine room door. According to 31-year-old Bob Kidd, the deck boss and one of the older crew members on the boat, Cornelius Green, their captain, was terrified and unsure how to handle their dire situation. Clifford Doc Stiegel, 32, approached Kidd, and they decided it was time to put on their survival suits. The St. Patrick was drifting sideways in the enormous waves, and the men believed a rogue wave could capsize the boat at any moment. A wave toppled a 55-gallon fuel drum on the deck that was used as a day tank to supply fuel to the engines, and an airlock formed in the line, causing the main engine and the electrical generator to shut down. The lights aboard the St. Patrick suddenly went out, and the crew panicked as they stood on the darkened ship and watched helplessly as the storm tossed it like a toy in the rolling ocean. Doc Stiegel opened the wheelhouse door, and what he saw ratcheted up his panic several more notches. Seawater dripped from the ceiling, and navigational equipment dangled from the wiring. The captain, tangled in the wiring and receiving intermittent shocks, struggled to free himself. Wallace Thomas, a 23-year-old crewman from St. Augustine, Florida, stood with his legs spread wide, sending out frantic mayday calls over the radio. He received no answer. Cornelius Green began yelling, "We gotta get off this thing! We gotta get off!" When Doc heard the terror in the captain's voice, he turned to Bob Kidd and screamed, "We have to abandon ship! We haven't got any power! We're going to lose it!" Doc raced to the lower deck. According to Kidd, he tried to reason with Doc and convince him to calm down and wait. But Doc's panic was infectious, and Kidd also soon believed their only choice was to quickly abandon ship before the St. Patrick rolled over and sucked them into the icy depths. The two men found a length of line, tied themselves together, and then jumped from the side of the boat. Ten crew members remained aboard the St. Patrick, but there were only 7 survival suits on the vessel. This meant 3 of the crew would have to jump into the 40-degree water wearing only life jackets. A survival suit is a type of waterproof dry suit, and it is intended to protect the wearer from hypothermia. An inflatable tube keeps the wearer's head above the water and reduces the effort the person must expend to remain in a stable position. Without a survival suit, a human can only survive approximately up to 2 hours in 40-degree water and will likely lose consciousness well before then. A survival suit dramatically increases the survival time. According to Wallace Thomas, he helped the young cook, Vanessa Sandin, pull on her survival suit. As the crew made its way to the stern of the vessel, heavy winds and freezing spray battered them. The St. Patrick rolled violently without power to steer the boat, and the waves swept over the deck. The boat's life raft had been securely stored behind the wheelhouse, but when the crew went to retrieve it, the raft was gone. Either one of the crew members had released it from its cradle, or the storm had dislodged it. A crew member saw the inflated raft rolling in the waves behind the St. Patrick, its safety leash no longer tied to the vessel, and the crew identified it by its yellow canopy light glowing in the dark, stormy night. To make their dire situation even worse, one of the crew yelled, "When the water hits those batteries, they're going to explode." He was referring to the rising water in the engine room, but his warning was invalid. The batteries would not explode when the seawater covered them. Unfortunately, the young, inexperienced crew believed him. The life raft wasn't far away, and the crew felt they could swim for it once they entered the water. They loosely tied themselves together with a long piece of line so they wouldn't drift apart in the stormy seas. Worried that the St. Patrick would capsize at any moment and terrified the batteries would explode once the rising water in the engine room covered them, the 10 crew members climbed onto the railing and leaped into the raging North Pacific. They tried to reach the life raft, but the raft drifted away faster than they could swim. They were left on their own with no shelter in 20-foot seas. The clock began ticking. Those without survival suits had less than 2 hours. Those with leaky survival suits had a few hours longer. And the crew members lucky enough to be encased in intact survival suits might survive the night. Bob Kidd and Doc Stiegel had donned survival suits before leaping over the railing of the St. Patrick. Wave after wave sucked them down as they swam away from the vessel, and each time they had to force their way back to the surface. They worried they would become entangled in the line connecting them, so they untied themselves and instead locked arms. They reclined on their backs and tried to ride over the rollers, but the towering waves continued to collapse down upon them, driving them underwater, pulling them apart, and forcing water into their suits. Each time they surfaced, they yelled until they found each other, and then they repeated the exhausting cycle. Even though Doc's survival suit was new, he had trouble getting his inflatable collar to work correctly, and a few hours later, his suit began to leak and fill with seawater. The other 10 crew members swam as fast as they could to put distance between themselves and the steel hull of the St. Patrick. Waves pounded them, pushing them deep into the freezing black ocean. They fought to the surface and gulped salty air, just in time for another wave to plunge them underwater. The large waves washed some of the group out of the line that bound them to the others, and they furiously fought to find the rope and hold on to it. Before long, the line began to tangle around them. 2 of the crew clung to Wallace Thomas. One was Vanessa Sandon, and the other was John Blessing, one of the crew members who did not have a survival suit. Blessing was already shaking violently from the cold water. Someone screamed to the crew to sound off. A few obeyed, but others did not hear the command or were too disoriented to comply. After another colossal wave submerged them and they regained the surface, Thomas noted that Blessing was moaning and speaking irrationally. They had only been in the water for 20 minutes, but Blessing was already succumbing to the effects of hypothermia. "It's cold. It's so cold," he gasped as he shivered. The relentless seas continued to batter the group. Once, when they regathered on the surface, someone asked if the others thought they should pray. They began reciting the Lord's Prayer, but were halfway through it when another wave broke over their heads, driving them into the depths. Thomas attempted to hang on to John Blessing, but a wave wrenched Blessing from his grasp, and Thomas could not reach him as the ocean swept him away from the group. Soon, Vanessa again grabbed Thomas's arm. Her survival suit leaked, and the neck cushion wasn't working properly. She had to struggle to keep her head out of the water. Thomas held on to her when he could, but each wave tore them apart. Larry Saunders's body bumped into Thomas's back a few minutes later. He was another one of the crew members who had left the St. Patrick without a survival suit. Nearby, Thomas heard Jim Harvey, the 3rd crew member who had abandoned the ship without a suit, moaning and asking for help. Thomas knew that Harvey would also soon succumb to the elements. Before long, Harvey stopped shivering and lay motionless, still tied to the rest of the group. Meanwhile, Doc Stiegel's survival suit was leaking, and he grew weaker and weaker. He and Bob Kidd held on to each other, but each pounding wave tore them apart. Each time they struggled to the surface, Doc grew weaker. Kidd frantically found his friend and held on to him, but he could tell that Doc had lost hope and was giving up. Finally, Doc floated away, and no matter how hard Kidd yelled, his friend did not reply. Doc Stiegel's body was never found. Kidd was alone, and he felt doomed. He believed it was only a matter of time until the ocean took him to his watery grave. Night finally gave way to a gray dawn filled with fog and enormous waves. As Kidd rode one of the waves to its crest, he thought he saw land in the distance. Was he hallucinating? A few minutes later, he made out a point of the land through the fog. Could he reach it if he swam toward it? He didn't know, but he had to try. The gray dawn did little to reassure the other 7 crew members who had survived the night. In the daylight, Wallace Thomas could see the huge waves and watch the wind rip the tops off them. He felt little hope he would be rescued in this vast ocean. Then, in the distance, he saw someone swimming. He yelled to the others, "I can see somebody swimming over there." "Hey, it's the skipper," someone responded. They yelled and blew the whistles attached to their survival suits, but the captain didn't seem to hear them and continued to backstroke away. A moment later, Vanessa yelled, "I can see land! I can see it! I'm sure of it!" Wallace also saw the land, and he and the rest of the crew began to swim toward it in their bulky survival suits. Several hours later, the crew members could make out the steep, rocky shoreline topped with spruce trees and brown vegetation. They decided to swim for the nearest outcropping, but the waves continually threw them off course. They altered their course slightly to swim with the waves, but everyone grew steadily weaker as they burned their meager energy reserves. Ben Pruitt suddenly collapsed face down. The 2 crew members on either side of him rolled him over onto his back and encouraged him to swim. He tried, but he could barely move. Vanessa was also growing weak. As they neared the coastline, they watched the powerful waves break on the cliffs, and Thomas wondered how they would ever get on shore in these conditions. If they approached land, the waves would smash them against the cliffs and kill them instantly. "Before we try to go in, we've got to untie," Thomas told the others, and they agreed. The group continued swimming, but Ben Pruitt again rolled over, and this time he could not be revived. Vanessa Sandin and some of the others continued to grow weaker. Later that afternoon, Kidd approached the wave-battered cliffs of what he would later learn was Marmot Island, a small, uninhabited island east of Fognak Island. He studied the shoreline, but did not see a safe place to attempt a landing. He watched the monstrous waves pile into the vertical shale cliffs with a deafening roar. After a few moments, he tried to swim away from the cliffs, but he wasn't strong enough to swim against the current. Suddenly, a wave pushed him toward shore. He said the next thing he knew, he was underwater, pounding against the cliff. As he tumbled in the waves, water filled his survival suit. He said he felt as if he were caught inside a water balloon, and he knew he had to free himself from the suit if he had any chance of surviving. As soon as he unzipped his suit, the powerful current stripped it from his body. When the next wave threw him against the cliff, he grabbed handholds in the rock face. He gripped the rock as tightly as he could with his hands as the waves battered him. Slowly, he managed to climb up the cliff until he reached a ledge high above the surf. He was wet and dangerously cold, but he was out of the water. The remaining 5 survivors swam to what they estimated was a half-mile from the wave-swept cliffs. Harold Avery volunteered to approach the shore first. He told the others he would signal them to follow him if he made it. Hopes surged as Avery began swimming, and the other 4 could settle back and await his signal. They untied themselves from each other in preparation for the swim to shore. Wallace Thomas held Vanessa across his lap, while Paul Ferguson and Kurt Nelson remained together. As they waited, the 2 couples began to drift apart. Thomas watched for a signal from Harold Avery, but he saw no sign of his deckmate. The current carried Vanessa and him closer to land, and as he watched the crashing waves rocket up the shale cliffs, his optimism began to diminish. He saw a bright orange object in the distance. The waves tossed it like a toy against the rock cliffs. A wave would sweep it away from shore until the next wave caught it and carried it back, throwing it against the cliff. At first, Thomas thought the orange object was a buoy, but then He understood. It was not a buoy slamming against the rocks, but the lifeless body of his friend Harold Avery. Thomas did not tell Vanessa about Harold Avery. She was growing weaker by the minute, and he wondered how the two of them would ever make it to shore. She could no longer move her legs. The feeling had gone out of her arms, and her lips had turned dark blue. Thomas was also beginning to shake uncontrollably as his body tried to produce heat. His legs felt heavy, and his back and arms began to cramp. He knew he couldn't carry Vanessa much longer. When a Coast Guard helicopter flew over them, Thomas waved frantically, but the chopper continued on its way. A short while later, Vanessa lost her fight and passed away. Thomas had no idea what had happened to Paul Ferguson and Kurt Nelson. As darkness descended upon him, he was alone and convinced he would also soon die. Bob Kidd somehow managed to leap across a crevasse in the rocks and pull himself to the top of the windswept cliffs. He soon found a stream and slowly drank some water. His socks were shredded from climbing the cliff, and he took stock of his swollen, discolored, frostbitten feet. He knew he had to conserve his body heat or he would die from hypothermia. He found shelter under a fallen tree and quickly fell asleep. When the moon broke through the clouds, Wallace Thomas saw a point of land not far away and pushed himself to swim toward it. He headed to what he thought was a partially protected cove in the vertical cliffs. A wave broke over him as he neared shore, tumbling him beneath the surface. He struggled to the surface, but then another wave grabbed him. The vision of the waves flinging Harold Avery's body through the air rushed through his mind. Suddenly, his hand struck a rock, and as the water receded, he found himself on the face of the steep bank. He had no energy left, but knew he had to move before the next wave caught him. He crawled a short distance up the bank when the wave exploded at his feet. He was too weak to stand, but pulled himself up to a shallow rock crevice and rolled into it. He immediately fell asleep. Thomas awoke the next morning weak and dehydrated. As the tide ebbed, he crawled down to a narrow band of shoreline along the base of the cliffs. He forced himself to stand on his wobbly legs and slowly moved along the beach until he heard water dripping off the rocks. He drank a few gulps of fresh water. He felt better, but was dangerously cold and knew he would not last much longer. Then Thomas heard the rumble of an engine, and he pulled himself up onto a large rock and began waving his arms. A ship headed toward him, and he thought he saw flashes from the wheelhouse. Were they signaling him? Soon a Coast Guard helicopter roared overhead. The pilot maneuvered close to the cliffs, the side door opened, and a rescue basket dropped in the surf near Thomas. He crawled into the basket, and a guardsman lifted him into the aircraft. When Bob Kidd saw the Coast Guard helicopter, he slowly made his way down to the beach and was rescued a while later. Kidd was in critical condition, with a body temperature of 81 degrees when he reached the hospital. Dr. Martin J. Nemiroff, a Coast Guard physician and one of the world's leading hypothermia experts, treated Wallace Thomas and Bob Kidd. The Coast Guard recovered 3 bodies from the Marmot Island surf, and several more bodies floated nearby in the ocean. Vanessa Sandon's body was found 2 weeks later near Kodiak. Bob Kidd and Wallace Thomas were the only survivors from the St. Patrick. A commercial floatplane pilot flying from Kodiak to Afognak Island sighted the abandoned St. Patrick less than 12 hours after the crew had left the ship, and while 8 of the crew still floated in the ocean. The St. Patrick was listing, but it was still floating. The crew would have survived the storm if they had stayed aboard instead of panicking and fleeing the ship. Another scallop boat towed the St. Patrick to Women's Bay near Kodiak, where it sat on a mooring for the next 8 years. Anyone driving along the road could see the ghostly vessel as it slowly rusted. Then, in 1989, the ship vanished, sinking to the sea floor. Kodiak residents breathed a sigh of relief. They would never forget the tragic story of the St. Patrick and its doomed crew, but at least they didn't have to look at the boat day after day. However, the St. Patrick was not yet done wreaking havoc. The 2 survivors and the families of the other victims sued the owners of the St. Patrick. Before the boat began its fateful last trip searching for scallops, the Coast Guard had issued it a verbal warning for operating without a licensed master. The owners of the St. Patrick had ignored the warning and had ordered the boat to fish for scallops anyway. There was no experienced licensed captain aboard who could direct the crew when the vessel got caught in a storm and high seas. Instead, the captain panicked, and the crew jumped into the icy ocean, where they had little chance of survival. The legal case dragged on for nearly a decade. It went to the Federal Court of Appeals twice before the court finally awarded $8 million to the 2 survivors and the estates of the deceased crew members. On August 3, 2021, a passerby noticed an oily sheen on the water surface in Women's Bay. Divers determined fuel was leaking from several pinholes where the rivets had rusted in the hull of the sunken St. Patrick. The Alaska Spill Prevention and Response Division cleaned up the mess and released a sonar image of the boat's final resting spot. The state was not successful in tracking down the owners of the vessel to find them and demand they pay for the cleanup. The St. Patrick disaster played a crucial role in the 1986 congressional hearings in Washington, D.C., aimed at improving the safety standards aboard commercial vessels in U.S. waters. As a result of those hearings, all commercial fishing vessels must carry survival suits for each crew member. Life rafts, radios, and extensive crew training are also mandatory. Commercial fishing is still dangerous, but the number of fatalities has decreased with these new safety regulations. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thank you to my patrons for your support. Check out the show notes for more information on how you can support this podcast and unlock extra episodes by joining the Last Frontier Club. If you haven't already done it, be sure to join the Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier Facebook group and chat about the podcast. I'll see you soon for the next episode of Murder and Mystery in the Last Frontier.